It's my intention to finish at or before 1 o'clock, but please interrupt me. However much you interrupt me, I will not delay your lunch. So, and if you interrupt, it'll give your colleagues a rest from my voice, which I'm sure they'll appreciate. I'm going to talk about how you extract information from academics, and I know 61% of you work for university or research organizations, so you're that end of the stream, and translate it to the commercial world. The top picture here is Oxford Brookes University, for those of you who don't know. The bottom picture is the premises of Becton Dickinson, which is on the Oxford Science Park. So I should start by explaining to you where my prejudice has come from, because this talk is all about communicating between two different civilizations. And I should explain to you where my prejudices are based. I read physics down the road a long time ago and did a research degree in cryogenics. And I taught engineering undergraduates in the highly esteemed University of Oxford. And then I got a job in an engineering company and found I kept losing arguments with engineers because I didn't speak their vocabulary. So I did the sensible thing and went to Oxford Brookes University and took an HNC, Higher National Certificate in Engineering. This is engineering essentially for technicians, and I didn't fulfill the minimum entrance requirements to get in here, because although I had 2 degrees from another university, I didn't know how to formally work a drawing board, and in those days that's what engineers had to do. Anyway, I got special permission and they let me in, and I spent a year learning to speak engineering. And then when you pursue a career in industry, you find that the people who stop you doing what you want to do are the accountants. You always come up against the accountants. So I found this fantastic course called the Diploma in Accounting and Finance, which is essentially accountancy as a foreign language. It's like tourist Spanish. It enables you to communicate with the natives, but not to become one. So I went and learnt to speak accounting. So now I can speak physics, engineering, and accounting. So wherever the argument is, I've got a good chance. Anyway, I got a job as an engineer, and I ended up running some companies owned by other people for a few years. And then in 1990, I fell out with my boss and got fired. This is a bad career move. In general, if you have a boss with whom you disagree, personal abuse in board meetings is a bad strategy, and you shouldn't do it. So then I was unemployed, or a consultant, as we call them in Oxford. And I met 2 rich guys. One was an accountant and one was a property developer, and they wanted to invest in some technology-based businesses. And I spoke technology and business. So we worked together for 7 years, and it was very successful. We started a company called Oxford Semiconductor, which we sold to some rich Americans, and we started a company called Oxford Asymmetry, which we sold for a lot of money to some rich Germans. Oxford Asymmetry was a spin-out from the university, and we actually sold it for more than £300 million. This was really quite good. The university made £11 million for a cash investment of 0. The university thought this was a really good idea. So they said, would I join them and help them build up a machine to make more of these wonderful things? So I joined in 1997, and over 10 years built up ISIS Innovation, which is Oxford University's technology transfer company, from which many of my examples will come. And I retired in 2007 from there, and I was a visiting professor at the Saïd Business School talking about this sort of stuff. I've been working with Cambridge Enterprise since 2006, and they've set up a similar thing to ISIS Innovation now, and their structure and philosophy is much the same. And I'm proud to say that I'm on the commercialization panel at Oxford Brookes, and I come to Oxford Brookes once a month and help them spend their seed money. So I'm now a non-executive director. I am a non-executive of Oxford Gene Technology, which is another spin-out. So you can see that my career actually started in industry, and then I went into the world of investment, and then I went to academia, and now I'm back in industry. So the whole thing was a waste of time, really. I'm back where I started. But I hope I've learned a few tricks along the way which may be useful to you. So what I'm going to talk about is give you the author's message so that if you don't remember anything else, you get that. I'll talk a bit about how things work down the road, some of the dirty tricks that we've developed for stimulating technology transfer, a bit about spin-out companies, because with some governments they're the flavour of the month, and finally about culture change, because that is what I think we're really talking about when we talk about technology transfer. So some of the easy questions. What's a university? I think a university is defined by great academics, great researchers, great thinkers, great teachers. I think a great university is not defined by great administrators or by great technology transferers or, with due respect, even great leaders. But I do think those of us who live in List 2 help recruit, retain and motivate the people in List 1. That's why technology transferers, I think, are important to universities. So the next big question is, what do we think a university is for? We could even spend the rest of the day debating who is supposed to answer this question, but let me give you my answer. I believe the principal products of a great university are teaching and research. There are few alternative sources of either university-type teaching or university-type research. You can say, yes, there's coaching companies, yes, there are industrial research labs, but I think university teaching, curiosity-led teaching and curiosity-led research are completely different animals. A valuable byproduct of what goes on in university are commercial opportunities. Now, I've spent the last 25 years of my life working in these, so let me not devalue them, but I use the word byproduct because there are many sources of inventions to commercialize. Apart from universities, there's all the commercial research, there's all the inventors in a shed, there's all the government-funded research labs. There's lots of sources of commercial inventions other than universities. It is a serious error to design a production plant to maximize the output of the byproduct if this is detrimental to the quality of the main product. In other words, if technology transferers like me get too powerful in a university so that the research is all commercially oriented and the teaching is all about training people to be useful in factories, we will lose as a society the most important part of a university. That's the first message. I believe technology transfer comes at the end of the research. I'm very worried when commercialization starts dictating the research in universities for the reasons I've said. Of course, the value that we then extract must be maximized, and the rest of this talk is about that, but not at the expense of destroying a university. Ignoring this, I think, will turn some great universities into not great contract research companies. Universities are not great contract research companies because universities are packed with people recruited for their creativity and independence of thought. And if you're trying to fulfill a consultancy contract and you've got someone who keeps thinking independently and shooting off in different directions, it's not good. So, speaker's message. Technology transfer is about stimulating communication between two very different cultures, academia and business. My friend Richard Jennings at Cambridge describes this as interplanetary communication. You are trying to communicate between the planet academia and the planet commerce. The two cultures will not, in general, spontaneously understand each other. But there are, of course, always the occasional multilinguist. There are spectacular academics who work well with industry, and there are spectacular industrialists who work well with academia. But in general, it's hard. Therefore, intermediaries are required. And that's good news because that's where we come in. At least to start the relationship and probably to rescue the relationship every time they have a spat. It only works if the intermediaries have a real understanding of both cultures. There is not a single recipe that always works, but there are some underlying principles which I hope to illustrate. So, why is it difficult? If I describe the world of commerce, it is driven by external needs. You hear company chairmen all the time saying the customer is king, we must do what the customer wants, we must investigate our markets. It's external needs that drive commerce. there are clear goals in the company with commitments to the shareholders. If I'm going to invest in your company, I want you to tell me what you're going to do with my money and then do it. And of course, all the good stuff in the company is commercially confidential. We don't want our competition knowing how we do stuff. So with those three parameters, I've tried to encapsulate the commercial ethos. If we now go into the university lab and see what we find, researchers are on the whole self-directed. I know they've said in their grant proposal what they're going to do, and sometimes some researchers do what they say in their grant proposal. But you shouldn't blame them if they don't, because the next step in the experiment is to find what we learned yesterday. If we did some sort of chemistry yesterday and it worked, that says what we do tomorrow. If it didn't work, that says what we do tomorrow as well. So I believe that university research, even in big collaborative research groups, still has a spontaneous element in it, particularly the more creative research. And of course, finally, your academic career is measured by the quality and quantity of your publications. So just looking at those pairs of parameters, you can see that the inherent values are going to be different between the two planets. If I exaggerate the caricature even further and ask the commercial people what they think of academics, they will say something probably not as polite as this, but they say, well, of course academics never deliver, or if they do, it'll be late and it'll be different from what they said they were going to deliver. And if we go into the company, into the lab and say, what do you think of industrialists? The general thing is that, well, they're basically dishonest. They want all our ideas and they don't want to pay for them. Now, both these views are, of course, wrong, but nevertheless, they are generally well entrenched. So when we try to create a loving relationship between these two tribes, we can expect it to be challenging. And you won't be disappointed to hear that it is challenging. One way of looking at these, and remember, when I was a baby, I used to be a physicist, you can present these two parameters as orthogonal axes. There's the academic axis, and there's the commercial axis. And the property of orthogonal axes is because when you live on one of these lines, you can't see the other line. If you live on the academic axis along here, all you can see is this point here. And if you live on the commercial axis, all you can see is this point here. And representing these two civilizations as orthogonal helps us remember that in general, they don't know much about the other one. What's more, they don't know that they don't know. It's a bit like we don't know much about a fifth dimension because we can't see it. We can't say it doesn't exist. The fact that we can't see it is our failing, not the fault of God. So let's stick with this picture. So here's your baby technology transferer trying to get these two civilizations to communicate. And what we did at ICIS Innovation was recruited a few people who got PhDs, so they lived in the planet academia and spoke university research lab-ese, but they'd also had jobs in companies, so they could speak company-ese as well. In other words, they were two-dimensional or bilingual intermediaries. And what they could do, they could put on their ties and go and see the company and say, work with me, I won't let these flaky academics waste your time. And then they could take their ties off and go into the lab and say to the academic, come with me, I won't let these rotten industrialists cheat you. In other words, they can use their projection onto these two axes and the personal relationship between them and the two factions to persuade them to risk a bit of their self-respect long enough to meet. Now, what happens, of course, if you do this right, is that the academics find that the industrialists are, on the whole, honest and quite often have better toys than they've got. And the industrialists find that the academics are actually quite hard-working and are generally quite clever. So once you started this little interaction, like lighting a bit of brushwood, you can actually get a fire going. So that's the principle of interplanetary communication. And that results in a license or a consultancy. And so the academic axis turns money into research, and the commercial axis turns research into products. And this all works. There's examples of this all over the world. Very satisfactory. So let me talk a bit about what we actually did at ICIS Innovation, because I think this is probably one of the easiest and most difficult universities to do tech transfer in. It's easy because there's lots of clever people. It's difficult because the administration has been developing for 900 years with predictable consequences. So a bit about Oxford University. It does teaching and research. It's been doing teaching since 1188 when Gerald of Wales gave a lecture, and it's been doing scientific research certainly since the 1700s. In terms of the formal commercialization of results, the direct spending on commercialization is relatively recent. ICIS Innovation was set up in 1988. In 1986, the Thatcher government said to universities, if you can commercialize your results, you can own the IP. Before that, it was owned by the government and exploited by a government office in London called the National Research and Development Council, which has turned into BTG. And I was a research student in Oxford, 69 to 72, and what used to happen is a man in a suit would come down from London once a year to our lab and say, I'm from the NRDC, have you invented anything? We'd say no. He'd get back on the train, go back to London. Didn't take much of his time or our time, and it didn't transfer any technology. And the reason I raise this probably untrue example is it's the very opposite of what I'm talking about. So, formal technology transfer is a relatively new activity in an ancient university. The key ingredients of this model are the university has a rich portfolio of wholly owned IPR. Anything that's invented in Oxford University or using Oxford University's facilities, IP belongs to the university. There is obviously a strong world-class research base which has got 700 different sources of funding. It's not that we are funded by some central council that gives all the research funding, which means that because the research funding is diverse, it gives the university some opportunities to do things differently. There is a clear IP policy. It was finalised in 2000. It's led from the top, and it is still widely supported. It is quite usual in universities for the researchers to hate the IP policy. This was negotiated over 15 years, from 1985 to 2000, and by the time it was finally initiated, it was widely supported. The university invests real money in research support and tech transfer. There are about 150 staff in the research services departments of the university and ICIS Innovation. There is a clear internal demarcation of responsibilities to who's supposed to do what, which is very important in universities. And this is the policy. The university claims ownership of all employees and students' IP rights resulting from university research activities. The university assists those researchers who wish to commercialise. The who wish to is critically important. No one is forced to commercialise. There's lots of encouragement and bribes, but no one is forced to commercialise. It's a university. It creates, stores and disseminates knowledge. And we do this commercialisation by all the usual ways. The researchers personally share the benefits, and I'll tell you the rules. They get royalties from licenses, they get shares in spin-out companies, and they get income from consultancy. ICIS Innovation is a company established in 1988, 100% owned by the university. I think it's important that it's a company because it can behave in company-like ways. It is not tied by university administrative procedures or salary scales. If you run a company and you want to recruit a bright person, you talk to the chairman and you can probably get a job offer out in a couple of days. In a university, you write a job specification, it goes to the job evaluation committee, they say what grade it is, the grade will tell you what salary you can pay. By that time, the employee has already been employed by the competition for 3 months. So it is important, I believe, for ICIS Innovation to be a company. but it is 100% owned by the university. There are no cash investors, no external shareholders, which means that ICIS can act solely in the interests of the university. The researchers can't say, you are not commercializing my invention because you want to make a quick buck for your venture capital investors, and that's important. And the job of ICIS is to help researchers commercialize their research results. Current activities, this is year to March, 92 patents, 105 licenses, nearly 400 consultancy contracts, and 8 new spin-out companies. And that's a sort of typical sort of year now. But don't forget, this adventure started being invested in 1997, so it's slow to build up. I said I'd tell you the school rules for sharing stuff. If a researcher comes to ICIS and says, I've had a brilliant idea, will you patent it? And we think it's got some future. We patent it. We get £3.1 million from the university this year to spend on patents. I should say that when I started in 1997, that was £40,000. So you can see that as that's gone up, as the credibility is increased in the university, so is the investment in patents. When royalties come in, ICIS recovers the patent costs and then keeps 30% of the ongoing royalties and sends the rest back to the university, who share it out. And this is how it's shared out. For the first £72,000, the researchers personally get 60%. In other words, a big hit early on. This is the motivate the researchers bit. The university gets 10%, which covers the costs of administering the 60%, and ICIS keeps 30%. Then as the deals get bigger, the researchers get less, the university gets more, and critically, the department that the research was done in gets some. You want to keep the heads of department on side as well as the university. And that seems to work quite well. There have been very few objections to that. When we start a spin-out company, the equity is shared between the academics, and it may not only be the people on the patent, it may be the people who the academics think have contributed to it, the university, the cash investors, and the managers. And the rules here are vaguer. We used to have a rule saying that the academic and the university get similar amounts, because if the academic wasn't in Oxford, they might not have had a company, and if the academic hadn't done it, the university might not have had a spin-out. This is now increasingly under pressure. A number of investors want the university to have a lot less, and of course the academics think this is a really good idea. Some of the university thinks it should have a lot more because it owns all the IP. So this is now case by case. The investors get what they negotiate for, and the managers get a percentage depending on how essential we think they are. But the important point is, note everyone on this list has a veto. If the academics say, I'm not doing it, there's no spin out. If the university says, we're not putting the IP in, there's no spin out. If the investors don't invest, and so on. So the job for the tech transfer is to help all these people agree on something that doesn't add up to more than 100%. There's a thing called Tim Cook's rule, which you're welcome to use. When you have a bunch of academics, investors, all of whom want to have 60% of the equity, you write down their names and you write 60% next to each one, then you add it up and it comes to 240%. And then you say, but there's Tim Cook's rule, and that is that the total equity in a company can never exceed 100%. And they say, oh, yes, this is a lot better than saying to Professor Important, you are being stupid. So do not have equity over 100%. It's a mathematical impossibility. The third thing that we started doing a few years ago was helping academics set up personal consultancies. Academics in Oxford are allowed 30 days a year to do personal consultancy. And in general, they sell their time too cheaply. So we help them find opportunities. The university must approve the contract to make sure that the academics are not selling IP owned by some research funder, but in general, the terms are a matter for them. And a few years ago, we offered them an optional service to find opportunities, to help them negotiate rates and manage administration. There's time to tell you one more untrue story. There was an Oxford academic who was invited to appear on the radio in a discussion programme on his subject for a fee of £500. And the academic replied saying he'd be delighted to partake, and he enclosed his cheque for the £500. So we've moved on a lot from there. But nevertheless, it is quite difficult for someone who is an authority on something to ask for a decent price, because it's a bit, not nice. So having someone else to do that for you is good. For this service, we charge 7.5%, but if you've been getting 500 quid and you get 2,500 quid minus 7.5%, this is still a good deal. From the technology transferer's point of view, this is a great strategy to get to talk to researchers, because it's not such a big deal for a first-time researcher to start a consultancy as it would be to start a license or a spin-out. So, how's all this worked? ICIS has got 90 staff at the moment. We get 3.1 million from the university to spend on patents. We sent back to the university £6.8 million. We've created 8 spin-out companies for them. We've filed 92 patents, and we've helped the researchers win 19 million of translational funding. Translational funding is people who want to support a university doing it, and they're much more likely to support a university doing it if the university's got a demonstrable record in commercialization. So here's the same information in graphic form. The blue bars are the money that the university puts into patents, and you can see this is the, is there a laser on here? Probably not. This is the 3.1 million. The dark blue line is the investment in patents. The light blue line is ICIS's sales income, and the red line is what ICIS sends back to the university. So if you compare the red line and the dark blue line, where they cross over in 2005 is when the university started getting more money back than it was spending for the patent bill. Now, commercial people hate this, because if it takes from 1997 to 2005 to pay back, this is not much of a company. And that criticism belies the fundamental function of this company. This is not a profit-making company. It's a technology transfer company. And when people ask me how I would measure the success of a technology transfer company, it's not using these parameters. It's saying how much technology has it transferred, because that's what it's supposed to do. But nevertheless, if you're trying to convince a nervous university administration that this is a worthwhile exercise, feel free to use this data, because if you do what I say and you do it for 7 years and you've got a reasonable research base, it'll more than pay for itself. So now a bit about the dirty tricks. The philosophy of ICIS is we support researchers who wish to transfer technology. It is vital that we help researchers see that commercial engagement can enhance their academic work. There's some research done by Conrad de Backera, somewhere in Belgium, where he looked at the publication record of academics who got involved in commercialization, and he looked at their records before and after. And what he found was that after, they published more, and not only did they publish more, but they published more in science journals as well as applied technology journals. Now, this may just be an example of good people do good work, but I do think that expanding your researchers' field of contacts to the commercial world can only add to what they do. And one of the ways that it helps their academic work is provides additional resources, both physical and intellectual. But for technology transfers, we have to remember that the researcher's interest is key to our success. If they don't have confidence in us, they won't tell us their inventions. And we generate this enthusiasm by lots of internal marketing in the university to researchers and to the university administration, the IP policy and rewards, of course. Recognition, senior staff in the university are commercially active, and commercially active staff achieve senior positions. Heads of departments, pro-vice-chancellors are now people who have been and still are commercially active. And this is a real fundamental shift for an elderly university to not think that trade is something that the poor people do. Trade is actually part of the mission of the university. And finally, employing high-quality staff in the technology transfer office, experienced in the two worlds of research and industry. If your technology transfer office is short of funds, which they all are, it is a serious error to employ someone who is not good, because they will be a negative asset. They will just reassure the researchers that their prejudice against commerce is valid. So I think high-quality TTO staff is absolutely crucial. In terms of internal marketing, I've described it as set up a lighthouse to attract researchers, spend a lot of time on promotion, mail shots, newsletters, magazines, web, lectures, handouts. If the Department of Engineering Science wants someone to talk about patents, someone from the TTO does it. If the Chemistry Society wants someone to talk about how to start a company, the TTO does it. You have to be there, you have to be in the coffee rooms, the lectures, the lunches. In other words, the technology transferers have to live in the same world as researchers. If I'm in Oxford, I will have a cup of coffee in the biochemistry cafe, and I'm bound to meet 3 people who I could do to talk to. Compare and contrast this with the man in the suit who comes down once a year from London. You can see the point I'm trying to make. And I do believe that the sociology of this is the most critical factor. I think this is more important than the university's technology transfer policy. I think it's more important than almost anything else, because if you have a good relationship between a technology transfer and a researcher, they will do some good stuff regardless of the environment. I've been doing some work in northern Italy, and in Italy it's not possible for the university to own the intellectual property, they tell me. But nevertheless, with this setup, even if the university didn't own the intellectual property and everything else was the same, if I'm talking to a researcher, I can say a patent will cost you this many tens of thousands of pounds. If you work with ICIS Innovation, they will file the patent and absorb all the costs. 9 out of 10 patents don't cover their filing costs. So you, a wise researcher, let them pay for all 10. You will still get 60% of the one that worked. This is a good deal, regardless of the university owning or not owning the IP. And that's where this sociology, I think, trumps all other cards. I thought I'd say a bit about management, because managing in a university is probably an oxymoron, but I'll say what I say about it. In a regular company, the workers are employed by the manager. And as I've described, the workers' role is to perform their part of the plan, and if they all do their bit, it all works and the company is successful. And if they're not, it won't be. The company will fall to bits. In a pop group, the manager is employed by the performers. And the role of the manager here is to do all the stuff that enables the pop performers to do what they do. I would like to suggest that management of academic superstars is much more effective if the second model is followed. In other words, it's not we're the bosses and you do what you say. It's you do your research, how can we help? I've seen this succeed in areas that you'd be surprised, and I've seen it fail in areas where you think, why don't these people just do what they're told? And it turns out that they're Nobel Prize winning scientists, and they know a lot better than the people who are telling them what they should be doing. This message is crucially important to technology transfers, because if you become the IP police rather than the researcher's friend, they won't tell you anything that you want to know. One thing about a trick we use for attracting businesses, I told you when I joined ICIS in '97, the budget was £40,000. ICIS at the time was raising about £200,000 a year from the Oxford Innovation Society, which was an industrial club who used to pay a subscription once a year to get close to Oxford. And part of my pitch to increase the patent budget was to say to the university, look, these industrialists are putting in £200,000, you're putting in £40,000, why aren't you as confident as they are? And that was a good negotiating tactic to get the budget up. And this has been going for a long time. They pay £6,800. They get ready access to academics and the university. They get notification, they get a month's priority notification of new patents. They get invited to meetings 3 times a year, and we put on customised presentations for them. Now, this is all the stuff that TTOs ought to do anyway, but to do it specially well for specially important companies is a really good way of bringing together this link. And of course, there's all the usual stuff. Now, I should just spend a minute describing this, because this looks like a jolly dinner. In fact, when these people turn up, they go into a lecture theatre, and an Oxford academic will give a presentation on their research. And we ask the academic to talk for intelligent teenagers. The members of the Innovation Society are commercial companies, pharmaceutical companies, accountants, lawyers, commercial property developers, all sorts of companies. And to see some world-leading scientists talking about their subject in a way that they would describe it to their teenage child is fantastic. So everyone's really hyped up by this. This dinner is sponsored by one of the member companies, and so they then give a presentation on a business subject of their choosing, which is normally what a jolly good firm they are. And then they go into dinner. We give them champagne first, then they go into dinner. Now, this, as I say, looks like a jolly dinner. The people who are invited to this, each member company gets 2 invitations, but ICIS decides who else goes. Which researchers go, which university administrators go. More than that, they decide who sits where. I've had the privilege of going to quite a few of these, and when I got my table plan for a recent one, it was version 14. And what happens is this table plan goes up on the wall in the tech transfer company, and everybody has a go. So a project manager will say, could you put me between him and him? But don't, whatever you do, put those 2 anywhere near each other, because they might fight. And there's a lot of thinking goes into it. What's more, at half time, they all move round. So this is not a jolly social event. It starts at 5:30 and finishes about 10:30. It's very quiet at ICIS the next day. But after a few of these, you really can build up a network around your university. Oh, and there's after-dinner drinks. You can see there's quite a bit of alcohol involved in this process. One other machine we've got for helping build these links is the Begbroke Science Park. I should point out to you that beg in English is the act of asking for money. And broke in English is the word for not having any money. So it seemed particularly apposite for a university advention to establishment to call itself Begbroke. Actually, it's just the name of the small village, but nevertheless. And on this site, there are some real pieces of university research. The Department of Materials there had an electron microscope with, I think, the highest resolution in the world for a time. There's proper university research there. There's a couple of innovation centres where you can take a room for a month if you fancy having a go at doing a spin-out. And there are some proper companies. This one down at the bottom left is Oxford Gene Technology, which is where I'm currently non-executive. And in the middle of this site is a CAF. And the great thing about the CAF is that real researchers, real companies, real innovation centre people can see each other over lunch, and they can talk about what they do. So this, if you like, is a reaction vessel. I said I'd talk a bit about spin-out companies. Yeah, we're all right. If we're talking about spin-outs rather than consultancy and licensing, there is a third axis. In addition to academia and industry, there are investors. For a long time, I thought investors were just a subset of industrialists, but thinking more deeply, they are definitely not, and I'll explain the differences. So here are the 3 tribes, if you like, and caricatures. Academics are insiders. Most academics work for one university. Ditto managers. Investors, on the whole, are outside whatever organisation we're talking about. Academics usually have one major interest. Managers generally manage one company. Investors are quite promiscuous. They might invest in several things concurrently. For the academic, the route is undefined at the start. As I've mentioned, we're travelling over land which we haven't yet drawn the map for. For the managers, there has to be a coordinated plan and coherent activity, otherwise the company just won't work. And for the investors, the activity is we'll evaluate lots of opportunities, we'll invest in some, and we'll monitor and see what they do. And if it all goes wrong, the researcher has to find a workaround. You can't say, well, I'm not going to be a researcher anymore. The manager has to find out what's gone wrong and fix it, preferably before the boss finds out. But an investor is easy. You just sell your shares and move on to the next disaster area. So if you like, you can draw the investor axis down here orthogonal to both the other two. In other words, the investors really have no idea how academia works, and many of them don't know how business works either. So if we're going to do a spin-out, we're going to have a three-dimensional intermediary who speaks three different cultural values. You remember that a long time ago in my career I did this accounting thing. I've picked up some vocabulary there which I use to try and ingratiate myself with investors to this day. So it's a three-dimensional thing. And of course the investor axis just wants to turn little money into big money. That's their life's very simple. But these different activities need different skills. So if we follow the spin-out through its gestation period and look what the researchers can do, what the tech transferers can do, and what the shareholders can do, the researcher skills are obviously research. The tech transfer skills are, as I've hoped to demonstrate, relationship building. But what do you want active shareholders to do? You want them to drive the management. They normally don't need much encouragement in this. I mean, sometimes they need tuition in how to not be counterproductive in it, but in general, they do it. The main motivation of researchers, I believe, is research. I mean, research is not highly paid. You don't have chauffeurs or exotic working conditions. It's the research. Tech transferers, it's seeing it work. And for active shareholders, it's their carried interest. What are my shares going to be worth when we've gone through all this stuff? So the reward is wealth. And so what you want the researchers to do is to deliver clean intellectual property rights. This is increasingly difficult, and universities now, certainly down the road, there's a whole team of people trying to clean up or define the cleanliness of the intellectual property rights before we commercialize anything. Because if you've got a research group with 10 members, with 13 different sorts of funding and some contract funding which has IP clauses in, it is a major intellectual exercise just working out who owns what before you start. And good luck with it in your program. But nevertheless, if the university can deliver clean IP out of the tech transfers, they can deliver a spin-out company to the active shareholders. And then, of course, the active shareholders grow it. But these are very different skill sets. And it's some failures I've seen are where we've had people who are really skilled in one of these vertical columns, not realizing that the other vertical column is a different skill set. So, conclusions from this bit. Spin-outs involve more than one value system. This is a challenge for managers and advisors because spin-outs in general are quite pressurized. People do react emotionally. It's difficult to be rational when your house is on the line. So therefore, the calming effect of the tech transfers can make a huge difference to whether the company survives or not. Significant benefits can be won by understanding this. I told you Oxford Asymmetry, 300 million, Oxford Semiconductor, 100 million. There's a lot of money to be made from spin-outs if you don't cock it up. Failing to understand it may prove fatal. Most of the companies that I've seen fail have failed from management, shareholder, lack of collaboration. The result being the managers haven't had a job and the shareholders have had a loss because they've each tried to argue from the knowledge base of their axis what should be happening on a different axis. So a few words about culture change. I think what's happened down the road over the last 20 years can be parameterized in three different ways. And this holds for any university. The first thing is the entrepreneurial culture of the researchers. Now by this, I don't mean are they quick and free thinking? Of course they are, they're researchers. What I mean is the entrepreneurial in terms of applied entrepreneurship in the commercial world rather than creative academic thinking. And that, obviously, you want to increase. The second one is the university itself, the central administration of the university, and how much of its money and respectability, it wants to invest in technology transfer. And obviously you need to increase that. And the third one is a bit more subtle. It's what I've called the local professional environment. And by that I mean all the things around the university, outside the university, local council, local company, general public, do they see the university as a commercial contributor? I mean, I'm sure that my old university was seen largely as a tourist attraction because it's got lots of nice buildings. Certainly when I worked for Oxford Instruments in the 60s, and we would never dream of doing anything commercial with the university, even though it was a university spin-out, because, well, it's a university, you know, and our prejudices got the better of us. I suggest to you that all three of these parameters need to advance together. But I suggest that the university needs to lead the change. And I suggest this for two reasons. One, the ideas are in the university. If you're doing chemistry, putting the catalyst next to the reactants is a really good idea. Before the university was investing in ICIS, Oxford did about one spin out every 4 years. Every so often, a spectacular academic would pop up. Martin Wood in 1959, Oxford Lasers, but it was about one every 4 years. And this was because these people were the multilinguists I mentioned on slide 1, and they were going to do a spin out whether the university supported them or not, and they did. I can tell you that when I worked for Oxford Instruments for 12 years, and when Martin started it, he tried to give the university shares, and the university turned it down. If we have time at the end, I can tell you the story why, but suffice it to say that in 1959, Oxford University did not see itself as anything to do with any of this. It does now. Post-ICIS spin out every 4 spin-outs a year, so 16 times as many. So if you want to see the benefit of putting the catalyst next to the reactants, there's one snapshot. But the other one is, if the university doesn't lead this cultural change, I believe the university may not receive its share of the benefits. If we put something in the water and turned all our academics into raving entrepreneurs tomorrow, and the university hadn't set up any sort of technology transfer organisation, the circling venture capital sharks would see these easy pickings with all this IP and would pick them off. And the venture capitalists would do quite well. The researchers might well do quite well. I mean, venture capitalists are not all rogues. They may well reward the professors. But what's that done for building up the university structure and funding the university's overheads? Nothing. So therefore, I think it is important that if universities want to do this, they should initiate it and should make the investment in it. You might think, how do I make my university entrepreneurial? I've got this gene pool of commercially active scientists who know lots of good people in pharmaceutical companies. We've got some other academics, not sure what they do, but I'm sure they're valuable somewhere. We've got lots of clear policies about IP ownership and tech transfer and exploitation rights and royalty shares. And we've got a TTO. And what's more, we've joined them all together. So our university is there, we've made it, we're off. Sadly, not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because I've ignored the environment. Each university is actually a subculture in a much larger barter economy. I'm indebted to Jeff Skinner of UCL for this slide, and I always acknowledge it because I think it's so helpful. So here's the university, and of course there are other universities close by. And then around them, there's all the commercial organisations. So I've put startups, real estate, investors, lawyers, headhunters, companies, accountants, banks, all that. And there's a lot more blobs than I could get in. But as well as that, there are people like Eugene Sweeney and me, these itinerant brokers, managers, consultants, people who know people, who tell people to talk to people. And more than that, there's students. There's past students, some of whom may be highly influential in government or research or commercial circles. There are current students, of course, who some of them are an asset. And there's future students. So it's only when all that lot's joined together and all that lot sees the university as a component in this much larger barter economy that I think you can say that the university is now playing its full part in the commercial development of our region. Now this, some words on management of university. I've sent this slide to a number of vice-chancellors and also to a number of senior industrialists trying to deal with universities. So whether you're inside or outside, it might be helpful. And I originally put it together for new employees at ISIS Innovation who'd come from the relatively simple world of industry and just couldn't get to grips with something like a university. So I think you should think of it as like leading an elephant with a thin rubber band. That's the university and that's you. And my recommendation to you is that you walk along with the elephant in whichever direction the elephant's going until it gets used to you and starts to trust you. At this point, you can start to pull gently on your rubber band. If you pull too hard or too suddenly, you'll break your rubber band and have no further influence over the elephant. Now, if this was a business school, I could put this into business school speech and say, you need to invest in the relationship and build up your influence with key opinion form, but the elephant's more memorable. However, don't think you'll ever have complete control. The caption says, okay, I've got him, now hit him with the rock. Universities are useful friends, but they are, I believe, have a life of their own, and as a technology transferer or as an industrialist, there's no point telling the elephant which way it's got to walk. You can encourage it with buns and things, but that's the best you can do. Conclusions. Opportunities exist in universities for economic development, personal wealth creation, and to realise these benefits needs competent intermediaries. I think over the last 25 years, we've begun to understand this process, but I think as universities change, as cultures change, as governments change, it's always going to be difficult and it's always going to have to be imperfectly understood. But I think the times that it works more than pay for the majority of times when it doesn't work. So thank you for your attention. We have got 10 minutes, so feel free to ask any questions you'd like.
There's a question.
Yes, I do. I come from Sweden, where the professors themselves own the IP that they give rise to. And when helping them with their projects and sort of getting them together with companies, they often lack the courage to sort of, I'm giving them something valuable and I should get something in return.
They think the companies are crooks.
They think companies are crooks, but they also do not have the sort of confidence to demand something back. Do you have any suggestions?
If the university wants to provide a service, it can set up a technology transfer office, just like ISIS. It really does not need to own the IP, because the deal with the researcher could be, okay, researcher, we will do this for you. We will fund your patent. We will give you 60% of the royalties, in exchange for which you have assigned your rights to us on day one. Now, the researcher may say, oh, I'm not going to do that. You say, okay, well, it's optional. But I think, as I said it in my last few slides, I think universities ought to do this, because in the region that your university is, if this activity doesn't happen, there's a piece of commercial activity that isn't going to happen. So therefore, and you can probably get some money from these guys, they've got lots of hours, but I'm sure that there will be some framework thing to stimulate technology transfer, and if there isn't, there will be when Jörg gets back. So I think you can do what we did, and you'll have to persuade your university to put money into it, as I did in Oxford. But I think this ownership of IP rights is less important than people say, because we can't commercialize something from Dr. Awkward who doesn't want to do it, even though we own it. I mean, we could stop him doing it, but even that would be really bad politics, wouldn't it? You know, university quashes inventors' life-saving invention. You know, we can't do it. So I think the sociology will overrule it all. But the first thing you need to do is to convince your Vice-Chancellor that he wants to put some money into it.
But pending that wonderful moment in time, what do I do when I come back on Monday, stating to the Professor X that this is really something that could be commercially wonderful, and if you give it away, you should get something back.
Yeah. You mean he wants to give it away?
It might well work out that way.
Okay, well, if it's his and he wants to give it away, I don't see what it's got to do with you. If it's annoying to you that he's giving this thing away, perhaps you could offer to help him with the negotiations with the company.
Yeah.
You know.
That is what we do.
Or I'll tell you what.
To give it away, but they think that, oh, I have now £1 million equivalent close to me, and I can get it and I can do my research. And I see that money bag moving away unless I take it for free.
Yeah. But again, I suppose the point I'm making is that is his decision. You know this prayer about, Lord, give me strength to change what can be changed, patience to bear what can't be changed, and the wit to know the difference. And I think if you can't persuade him, then he'll do what he does. But I mean, what you could perhaps do is gather some evidence and create an alternative scenario. Now, you're putting yourself at risk here because you're saying, if you trust me, I think this will happen. And if it doesn't happen, it'll be your fault. One general rule of technology transfer is that it's never the academic's fault. Whatever it was went wrong, it's you. But on the other hand, if you're right, you might even get a grudging acknowledgement. I'll tell you one story about grudging acknowledgement. When we started Oxford Asymmetry in 1990, the lead academic was a man called Professor Steve Davis, who became chairman of all the chemistry in Oxford, a heavy-duty chemist. And he thought I was okay because I'd run his spin-out from which he'd made a lot of money. But in general, Oxford University thought ISIS innovation was a bad idea. So he was in this sort of odd position. Anyway, I took him out to lunch once a year for 5 years. And on the 5th occasion, he said something mildly complimentary about ISIS innovation. And I said, oh, does this mean you're an ISIS innovation supporter? And he said, oh, no, but I'm going to stop hitting you. Now, with some academics, if they stop hitting you, that's as good as it's going to get. But I think drawing a credible alternative scenario might be a way of convincing him, or possibly one of his co-workers. I mean, you can sometimes get to the big ego via his colleagues or her colleagues.
Anyone? Yes.
I've said in one of your slides that spin-outs normally involve more than one axiological systems. Could you expand, please, on this subject, and what is your solution for
More than one?
axiological system of values?
Oh, yeah.
And what is your solution for?
Right, I can tell you exactly the answer to that. So here are the 3 value systems. You've got academics who think like academics, you've got commercial managers who think like commercial managers, and you've got investors who think like investors. And you've got to have them. I mean, you can't say, right, we're not going to have any academics in this because otherwise they won't tell you anything. And my solution is this 3-dimensional intermediary here. And by this, I mean someone who can be trusted by the academics to look after their interests. I mean, so what we're talking about over here, actually. Can be trusted by the industrialists to look after their interests, and be trusted by the investors to look after their interests. This is quite difficult in one person. What you might do in your technology transfer office is have some people who do academic and commercial. In Oxford, we recruited a guy who'd been a venture capitalist, who had personal credibility. And so, if you like, the 3-dimensional intermediary became a composite person there. You know, ISIS Innovation can speak finance as well as speaking commerce and academia. But I think it's all, the only common currency in these 3 value systems is one-to-one personal relationships.
Does it have to be outside
The intermediary?
Yeah.
No, not at all. No. I mean, in ISIS Innovation, they're employees of a company owned by the university. So, no, I mean, it's quite difficult because if you put an outsider there, that's probably a fourth lot of interests. Because if I'm doing this, I want to know what I'm going to get out of it as well. So that makes it even more complicated. So this three-dimensional intermediary, I think, is somebody in the university's tech transfer company.
Anyone? Right, 2 minutes to 12. Yes.
Where do you see TTOs in the future? Do you see them as university-specific entities, which each university having its own TTO? Do you see them as national organizations supporting all?
I see them as each university having its own, because I think it's crucial that the people doing the technology transfer live in the same world as the researchers. They need to meet them in the coffee room and at the shops and so on. You can't have someone flying in from head office to have a meeting and then going away. So I think the sociology, the casual meetings are crucial. The way I do see it developing is when in the late 90s, when we started ISIS, it was a very small thing and it had to be self-contained, so it could sort of huddle together for psychological support. But what's happening now is the activity is getting more and more spread among the research departments. Now, this is good in that if there's someone in the biochemistry department all the time, they're going to meet people in the corridors and at the coffee room and so on. But what you have to be careful there is that this person doesn't go native and become the biochemistry administration department. I went to Australia and was at the University of Melbourne, and they have a system where they have a central TTO where everybody goes on Monday morning. Then they all go out into the departments and do all their stuff in the departments all week. And then on Friday afternoon, they all come back for the DTO again for indoctrination. And I think this spread versus local within a particular university is probably a good way to do it. Because, you know, the administration in a university research department has a million things to do, from changing the light bulbs to looking after the funding to dealing with violent students and everything. And if the technology transfer activity gets subsumed into that, it can get very diluted. So having it focused, I think, is important. You know, you want people who the first thing they think about when they get up in the morning is my technology transfer project, not I've got 30 crises, and then if there's time before I go home, I'll do a bit of technology transfer. So I think identified individuals spiritually close to the researchers, I think, is essential.
Yes.
I had a question about the legal form of ISIS. You said
It's a company, it's a limited company wholly owned by the university.
and it's for profit.
Yep.
What happens to the profit?
The profit is covenanted to the university at the end of every year. We budget it to make a small profit, but really it's budgeted to break even. The reason it's grown so fast is we spend everything we make in growth, because that's what the university wants us to do. It is not a cash cow. It's a technology transfer company, and the bigger we can make it, the more. You know, Oxford spends £400 million a year on research. It's spending £3 million a year, so that's less than 1% on patents still, and that patent cost is its total cost for ISIS. ISIS funds itself out of its 30%. So, you know, there's plenty to go at yet.
Yes.
You've explained a very complex sort of situation in itself in University of Oxford-led model. What about when we take it into multinational, multi-partner networks, as will happen in Horizon 2020? How much of that do you...
You've got a lot more orthogonal axes.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got... I sometimes use as an illustration for this when I'm talking about the three tribes. It's like setting up a company with a French person and a German person and a Dutch person. You've got to be able to explain French attitudes to life in German to the German, and German attitudes to life in French to the French. And I think if you've got multicultures, it's just a lot more axes, all of which are mutually perpendicular. But I do think that the academic tribe internationally has a lot of common values. And I think probably the commercial tribe has as well. Where you get into trouble, which is is not my area of speciality, is the European Commission, which is a tribe orthogonal to all other tribes.
I must say, as head of the European team at the University of Oxford, I am teaching ISIS Eurobabble as we speak.
I'm sure they're very grateful.
They're beginning to understand so that they're not undermining the demands of the Commission.
But I think the only way to engender credibility is to speak in the language of the person you're trying to engender it with. In fact, we were talking about this earlier on, weren't we? When filling in a grant, find out the vocabulary of the people who are going to read it and use that. And I think the messages in the vocabulary, I mean, when I read something now, I get as much from the vocabulary as I do from the content. Yeah, because you're all the time you're trying to work out, is this person like us, or is this person from a different planet? It's 1:05, chaps. I mean, I'll go on as long as you want to, but it's your lunch.
Is there any urgent question? The very last urgent question.
Yes.
Before lunch? And many more after lunch?
When you're looking for a technology transfer person, then would you consider it more important to have a research background or business experience?
That's really hard. We had a rule that we want someone who'd lived in a lab and lived in a company, and we did employ some from labs, not companies, on the grounds that you can teach them. I mean, the illustration I use is by reading a few books, I could write an article on what it's like to live in Shanghai, but it wouldn't be as good as if I'd lived in Shanghai. And it's all the stuff that you pick up by being somewhere. Now, you can, of course, if you've got some fantastic postdoc, you could second them into a company or something. So you can, I mean, you can engineer this. But I'm just thinking of some of the illustrations I use because I've been somewhere, and I've got a story about what it was like when I was there, and it's the difference between intellectually learning something and having lived somewhere and picked. I mean, I had a job in a steelworks. Now, the stuff this is the holidays, and the stuff I learned just by being in a rolling mill in Rotherham, I wouldn't get anywhere else, and that then became useful in subsequent life doing other things. So I wouldn't, you can't have hard and fast non-negotiable rules, but I think the easy way is to live there. Okay.
Thank you.
Lunchtime.